Beyond the fragile veil of reality lies a realm without distance or time, where thought shapes substance and emotion breathes form into the void. It is called by many names: the Immaterium, the Empyrean, the Sea of Souls. Yet among those who understand its true nature, it is known most simply as the Warp. Tonight we drift back through aeons to an age before the Warp's storms raged across the galaxy, before the laughter of gods echoed in its depths. We will trace its beginnings, from the first stirrings in the minds of ancient species to the cataclysm that would forever entwine it with the fate of mortal life. As you settle into rest, imagine yourself adrift in a calm, endless sea. The stars are far away, dim and unmoving, and the only movement is the slow ripple of unseen tides. Those tides are the first whispers of the Warp, a place that once existed in near-perfect stillness, a great psychic ocean mirroring the thoughts and dreams of the galaxy's earliest minds. In those primordial millennia, the Warp was neither ally nor foe. It was a reflection, an endless, unformed canvas upon which no emotion had yet scrawled its furious mark. The first civilizations to emerge under the galaxy's suns felt its presence only faintly, like a subtle warmth in the mind when they dreamed. They did not fear it, for it was gentle then, and its currents moved with the patient grace of deep time. We will walk slowly through its history, as one might walk the halls of a vast and ancient library, touching the spines of books no mortal has read in millions of years. Each chapter will open another door, to the elder races whose rise awakened the Warp, to the birth of its storms, to the shaping of gods and the eternal wars they wage beyond the sight of most mortals. Tonight's journey is not one of battle, but of remembrance. For in understanding the Warp's beginnings, we glimpse the shadow it would cast across every age of galactic history. So close your eyes and let the noise of the waking world drift away. Imagine the silence of the galaxy before the first cities rose, before the first songs were sung. A time when the Warp was calm, waiting for the touch of thought to stir its depths. We begin there, at the dawn of immaterial existence, in a peace so vast that only the slow breathing of stars could be heard. Chapter 1. The Still Waters Before Time. Before the age of empires and wars, before the first sun burned its light upon a living world, there existed a space beyond space, the Immaterium, vast and unbroken. It had no storms then, no predators or gods. It was an endless ocean of psychic potential, still and clear, mirroring only the faintest ripples of possibility. In those earliest epochs, the galaxy itself was young. Stars burned in their first fierce youth, and life had yet to claim more than scattered shores along the spiral arms. Worlds turned in silence, unvisited and unknowing. Yet even then, in the quiet void between suns, the Warp existed, its substance as fundamental as gravity and the pull of time. The first minds to touch it were not mortal. They were slow, vast intelligences that would not have recognized themselves as living by any definition humans might use. They drifted through the cold darkness in bodies shaped by the needs of their homeworlds, some clinging to the warmth of volcanic vents, others borne on titanic winds that howled above gas giant clouds. Their thoughts were few but deep, and each left a faint trace upon the Warp. At first, these traces were nothing, a barely perceptible quiver across an infinite expanse. But the Warp is no inert sea. It reflects, magnifies, and remembers. The first emotions, hunger, curiosity, the dim beginnings of fear, became the first true movements within the Immaterium. These movements were small. To watch them, then, would have been to watch the surface of a lake touched by a breeze too light to stir more than a shimmer. But in that shimmer lay the first shaping of a realm that would one day become a tempest. As the aeons passed, life multiplied. Stars gathered planets, and planets bore oceans, mountains, and skies. Simple organisms learned to struggle, to seek, to defend. Their collective will, however rudimentary, began to feed the warp. Each death and each birth added another grain to the unseen scale, and the stillness was no longer absolute. There were no gods to receive these offerings, no spirits to guide them. The warp simply absorbed, like an endless mirror that could not choose what it reflected. And yet, already, patterns began to take form in its depth. The faint warmth of satisfaction in a creature finding food, the ache of loss when it was taken away, the tension before the strike of predator upon prey. By the time the first true civilizations emerged, still millions of years before the rise of humanity, the warp had grown stronger. It was still calm, but it was no longer empty. One might liken it to a deep sea before a storm, its surface unbroken while powerful currents swelled below. Among those early civilizations, the first to understand the warp not merely as a shadow of thought, but as a place were the beings later called the Old Ones. Their mastery of the psychic was unmatched, even in later millennia. To them, the Immaterium was not mystery, but a tool, a second universe that could be navigated as surely as the physical. The Old Ones walked in both realms as easily as breathing, their vast intellects stirring the still waters for the first time in earnest. They built gates that spanned light years, anchoring them in both real space and the warp, creating paths of travel that defied the crawling speed of light. Through their use, the warp was no longer merely a reflection of thought. It became a highway, a power source, and a weapon. The stillness shivered. The sea began to remember the footsteps of those who walked upon its surface. Each psychic act left an echo, and those echoes lingered, slowly building into shapes of their own. Yet, even with the Old One's mastery, the warp was gentle compared to what would come. Its calm had not been broken, only disturbed. The patterns were subtle, their influence easy to miss. If one listened, then, drifting in its depths, one might hear the faint whisper of the first song, a harmony of countless minds breathing life into a realm that had never known it before. In those days, to cross the warp was to move through a dreamscape of light and color, where thought might bend a path and will alone could carry a traveler safely between the stars. The Old Ones believed it would remain so forever. They could not yet imagine that their works, and the rise of those who came after, would awaken something greater than they could control. But time is the patient enemy of all still waters. Every ripple, every echo, every act of will was a drop in an ocean that remembered everything. And as the first ages of galactic civilization unfolded, the warp began to gather more than memory. It began to gather hunger. Perhaps it was inevitable, for just as stagnant water will grow restless with the wind, so too would the warp grow restless beneath the weight of countless lives feeding it. In the unseen deeps, patterns sharpened into forms, and those forms waited. They had no names yet, but the galaxy would one day know them well. Beneath that grand quiet, the Immaterium, also called the Empyrean, learned to listen. Not in the way a mind hears, but as a sea feels the moon. It noticed the persistence of yearning, the way simple life clung to warmth, the way new minds paused at the brink of fear, and then chose to step forward. Each choice traced a line through the deep, and the deep remembered. The oldest star roads formed in silence. Where clusters of young suns glowed within their nebulae, the warp pressed gently against real space, a tide touching a shore. Sailors did not yet exist to ride those currents, but the paths were there, faint and patient. When the first true psychers appeared in distant ages, they would find these routes waiting as if laid down by intention. The beings later called the Old Ones an elder species of supreme psychic mastery, taught the sea to bear bridges. They learned that if thought is steady and feeling is disciplined, the warp becomes traversable. They did not bend it by domination. They asked, and the ocean made a lane. In time, they shaped the first precincts of the webway, a hidden labyrinth protected from raw tide, a sanctuary corridor that turned 1,000,000 light years into a single calm breath. There were early omens. In pockets where grief pooled and could not find release, the Immaterium thickened like rain clouds before a storm. In regions where wonder eclipsed fear, it grew luminous and easy, as if the whole realm smiled. The sea did not judge. It mirrored with perfect fidelity, and fidelity over long epochs becomes structure. So the still waters gathered meaning. Not language, not symbols, but tendencies. Courage harmonized with passage. Malice sharpened into resistance. Mercy smoothed difficult crossings. The map of the warp became a soft echo of the map of hearts, and because echoes grow with repetition, the galaxy unknowingly composed the first movements of a symphony it would one day be forced to hear. Chapter 2. The Awakening of Currents. The sea cannot remain still forever. Even in the earliest aeons, the Immaterium had begun to stir. What had once been a mirror of thought now became a basin in which the emotions of the living pooled. These pools were deep, and deep waters breed currents. The first true turbulence came not from humanity, which had yet to rise from the dust, but from the elder races whose minds were vast enough to leave lasting marks upon the warp. The old ones, who had walked the calm ocean as easily as the land beneath their feet, had not intended to change it. Yet every crossing, every shaping of its paths laid down unseen channels, and in time others would follow those channels, widening them with every passage. The Eldar, or rather their distant precursors, for even they were not yet the refined empire that would later fall, were the first to truly quicken the warp. Their senses and emotions were sharper than the stars themselves, and they poured into the Immaterium with the intensity of a people who lived in constant communion with the unseen. Where the old ones had used the warp with the discipline of builders, these new travelers used it like an open sky, leaping and dancing through its depths, leaving wakes of color and light that persisted long after their passing. Each journey, each psychic exchange, was a stone cast into the still sea. Waves began to meet, to crash, to spin into whirlpools that deepened with every generation. And unlike the old ones, the younger races did not walk with caution. They built their empires quickly, thinking the warp an endless, forgiving servant. They did not see that it was learning. It learned joy from them and longing. It learned triumph in the same breath as grief. And because the warp mirrors with perfect fidelity, it began to show these emotions back to those who touched it. Travelers in this age reported strange sensations. Laughter heard across the void with no source, fleeting shadows that flitted at the edge of perception, dreams that continued even after waking. The changes were subtle at first. Storms were rare, brief and gentle, like summer squalls on a placid lake. A psychic might sense resistance when opening a path, or feel a strange tug toward a destination they had not chosen. Some scholars of the time argued that the warp was not resisting at all, but guiding, though none could agree toward what. It was during these ages that the first proto-entities formed. They were not yet gods, but concentrations of emotion so vast that they took on a kind of half-life. In regions where the thoughts of countless billions had dwelt on the same ideas for centuries, the Immaterium began to knot around those ideas, shaping them into presence. The earliest known was the dreamer in the shallows, an amorphous intelligence born from the aspirations of 1,000 worlds in bloom. It was said to drift through the calmer regions of the warp, whispering visions of cities yet unbuilt and songs yet unsung. Another was the nameless hunger. A void in the sea that drew to itself the echoes of every predator's intent. Neither had will in the sense mortals know, but both could be felt, and in the presence of great psychic disturbance, both could act. The younger races learned to navigate with offerings, a ritual thought, a song repeated, a surrender of memory, small gifts to placate the currents they now sensed moving beneath them. For a time, this was enough to keep the oceans open and the travel lanes clear. But the warp had no anchor, no law to still its tides. As more voices entered it, as more passions were poured into its depths, its once clear waters clouded. The emotions of countless lives began to bleed into each other, blending into storms that no single mind could comprehend. The Eldar, flourishing under the guidance of their innate psychic gifts, shaped the warp as much as it shaped them. Their artistry, their relentless pursuit of sensation, left swathes of the sea bright and shimmering, while other regions darkened into shadows of obsession. A duel fought in real space between two champions might ripple into the Immaterium as a whirlpool of sharpened intent, spinning for centuries after the bodies had turned to dust. There were those among the elder races who saw the change and understood its danger. Some withdrew from warp travel entirely, sealing themselves within real space empires that would endure for millennia. Others delved deeper, seeking to master the new currents, believing they could tame them as the old ones once had. One such experiment was the construction of psychic way stations, thought beacons meant to stabilize the tides. These stations radiated harmony into the warp, intended to calm the storms and guide travelers safely through. For a time, they succeeded. But harmony is fragile, and when war came, as it always does, the beacons became weapons. Empires turned them against each other, twisting their song to sow dissonance in enemy paths. The sea, once a mirror, now learned the shape of spite. In the stiller corners of the galaxy, far from the great power's reach, the changes were felt in subtler ways. Seers who once had clear sight found their visions muddled by echoes of alien thought. Dreams grew stranger. The animals of psychic-sensitive worlds began to startle at unseen movements, and the skies above them rippled without wind. For the first time, the warp began to touch the material unbidden. Small, transient phenomena, a light that appeared where none should be, a voice in an empty hall, a sudden drop in temperature with no cause, became more common. The boundaries between realms were not yet weak, but they were thinner than they had been. It was in this age, still countless years before humanity's first spark of civilization, that the first true storms were recorded. They rose without warning, devouring the well-traveled lanes, scattering ships into uncharted reaches, and vanishing as suddenly as they had come. Entire fleets were lost, and in their place, strange derelicts would sometimes wash ashore in real space. Ships from centuries past, their crews frozen in poses of terror or joy, eyes still reflecting the colors of the sea they had drowned in. The elder powers convened, but there was no consensus. Some claimed the storms were natural, the inevitable result of increased traffic. Others whispered that the proto-entities had grown bolder, their hunger for thought and sensation swelling beyond the bounds of patience. A few dared to suggest that the warp itself was awakening, that the still waters of the beginning had only been sleep, and if it was waking, then the galaxy was standing at the edge of something it could not predict. What none could see was how quickly the pace of change was accelerating. The more life used the warp changed. The more it changed, the more it shaped the life that touched it. This feedback would not slow, it would build layer upon layer, until the great calm of the first aeons was only a memory. The sea that had mirrored the galaxy was becoming its second self, and in some places, its truer one. Chapter 3. The First Storms and the Fall of the Eldari Precursors. The sea's slumber was over. Where once the warp had been content to mirror the galaxy's life, it now dreamed its own dreams. Those dreams were strange at first, drifting shapes in the deep, currents that moved without mortal cause. But soon they grew into something more deliberate, something with the shape of will. The first storms came like whispers before they became tempests. Navigators of the elder empires spoke of finding their paths blurred, of currents that turned against them without warning. Entire routes, once safe for centuries, would close overnight, replaced by whirlpools of screaming color and pressure that crushed thought itself. At the heart of these disturbances were concentrations of emotion so intense they had coalesced into the first true warp entities. No longer vague shadows of feeling, these were beings, vast, formless by material standards, but alive in ways the galaxy had never known. They had no names in those early days, but later scholars would trace their lineages to the gods themselves. The first primordial stirrings of rage, cunning, decay, and desire. The Eldari precursors, who had been among the most exuberant voyagers in the warp's calm age, were the first to feel the storm's full fury. Their civilization stretched like a silver net across the stars, every strand tied by psychic thread to the Immaterium. Where others had relied on machinery, they had relied on mind, and the mind is the warp's native coin. In the days before the storms, their ships had danced between worlds in minutes, their seers reading the sea's surface like glass. But as the tides grew restless, those same seers began to report visions that were not their own. Symbols without meaning intruded into their dreams. Strange melodies followed them from waking into sleep. At first, the people thought it a sign of blessing, that the realm beyond was speaking to them more directly. They did not see that the voice they heard was not the sea itself, but the gathering winds of something rising beneath it. The storms struck first at the fringes. Outposts lost contact, their psychic beacons swallowed by howling static. Rescue vessels sent to investigate returned empty or did not return at all. Those few survivors who staggered back spoke of their ships sailing into curtains of living color that coiled and uncoiled like serpents in the deep. Shapes followed them within those lights, immense and faceless, yet somehow aware. Entire trade lanes collapsed. The warp was no longer a placid field to be crossed at will, but a territory contested by powers unseen. Some currents carried travelers in circles until their supplies ran out. Others threw them far beyond their intended destinations, into the black gulfs between the spiral arms. The empires that had built themselves on psychic travel found their foundations trembling. The Eldari precursors tried to adapt. They strengthened their psychic wards, wove more complex skeins of fate to predict safe passage, and developed living ships whose own minds could sense danger and turn aside. These efforts held for a time, but the storms were not mindless weather. They learned. As the Eldari adapted, the warp shifted in answer, weaving counter-patterns that unraveled each new defense. In the archives of lost craft worlds, there is a record of the Dreamfall Convocation, a gathering of the most gifted seers, held in the twilight of the Precursor Age. They spoke of a presence in the sea, not one but many, each vast enough to swallow the dreams of worlds. These were not random furies, they claimed, but the growing consciousness of the Immaterium itself, given shape by the accumulated passions of uncounted minds. Rage had learned to hunt, desire had learned to lure, decay had learned to wait, and change. Change was already teaching itself how to be all things. From that convocation came the first great exodus. Not all the Eldari fled, but many did, sailing to the far reaches of the galaxy where the storms were weakest. Others retreated into pocket realms shielded from the warp entirely, though these would become prisons as much as refuges. Those who remained doubled down on their mastery, believing that sheer psychic skill could command the sea back into obedience. The fall was not sudden. It came in waves, each storm season worse than the last. Cities that had thrived for millennia found themselves isolated for decades. Wars erupted over stable routes and habitable worlds untouched by the tides. The brilliance of the Aeldari precursors dimmed, their culture bending towards survival rather than art. And still the gods in embryo swam unseen through the deep, growing fat on the thoughts and fears of those who sought to resist them. The storms were no longer just disruptions. They became hunting grounds. A ship caught in such a tempest was not merely delayed, it was surrounded. Crew reported hearing their own memories repeated back to them in voices they trusted, or being offered visions of triumph if only they would surrender their will. Those who accepted vanished, their ships found later as drifting husks, hulls intact, but every mind aboard emptied to silence. Some scholars believe that it was in this age that the first true demons appeared. Shards of the proto-gods cast into real space like the spray of a breaking wave. They were formless at first, manifesting as storms of light, whispers in crowds, or sudden surges of madness in planetary populations. But as the warp's boundaries thinned, they learned to wear shapes that matched the expectations or fears of those who beheld them. The Aeldari precursors, for all their pride, began to worship. Not openly, not as the crude cults of later ages would, but in small, private rituals, offerings to the storms in hopes of safe passage, a whispered name before translation, a carved token left at the prow of a vessel. They did not see that such acts only deepened the bond between them and the powers watching from the deep. By the end of this age, the silver net of their empire was frayed beyond repair. The storms had grown so fierce that only the strongest fleets could move between the core worlds, and even then, voyages that once took hours might now take months. Isolated colonies turned inward, their cultures diverging wildly from the parent civilization. Some flourished in unexpected ways. Others burned themselves out, leaving only ruins for later ages to discover. And all the while, the gods beneath the surface fed. The proto-corn learned from every battle fought in desperation, savoring the heat of warriors' rage. The proto-Slayenesh drank deeply of longing and the grief of loss. The proto-Nurgle swelled on the quiet acceptance of those who knew they would not be saved. And the proto-Tzeentch, if such a name could yet be given, played in the shifting patterns of every plan made to outwit the tides. The Aeldari who survived would carry these wounds into the next age. In time, their empire would rise again, refined into the splendor that would one day fall to its own excess. But the storms that broke their precursors had set the pattern, and the sea would never again return to its first stillness. The calm before time was gone. The warp had found its own voice, and the galaxy would have to learn to live with the sound. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Great Powers. Beneath the heaving surface of the Immaterium, the psychic sea that reflects mortal thought, patterns had been gathering for ages. What began as eddies of shared emotion now deepened into gyres with centers of gravity all their own. Where rage pooled, it did not simply disperse, it remembered. Where yearning pressed like a tide against every boundary, it did not merely ebb, it carved channels. Where despair settled like silt, it did not vanish, it took root. And where scheming thought multiplied, it did not conclude. It branched again. The first to rise to true dominance was the Lord of Battle, later named Khorne, the warp's embodiment of war, bloodletting, and wrath. He was not born to a single moment, but to a drumbeat that never ceased, the clash of spear on shield across 1,000,000 worlds, the iron taste of victory and the copper tang of defeat. Every duel, every campaign, every oath sworn over a blade added weight to a storm that drew itself inward until the storm had a heart. It beat in time with the armies marching, and with it the sea learned a terrible simplicity, that conflict solved questions more quickly than parley, and that quick answers are addictive. From different waters rose the changer of ways, named Tzeentch, the warp's embodiment of change, sorcery, and ambition. Where Khorne condensed around the heat of violence, Tzeentch coalesced around the flicker of ideas. He steeped in scholars' sleepless nights, in statesmen's tangled bargains, in magi-teasing pattern for mystery. He found nourishment in the tension between what is and what could be, and his birth was the moment possibility realized it could reshape reality as readily as thought reshapes a plan. In his coming, the sea learned to braid currents into cunning streams, each promising a different shore. The third to ripen was Nurgle, the warp's embodiment of entropy, endurance, and the melancholy of acceptance. He swelled not from sudden acts, but from the long, slow sorrow of lives pressed by time, the patient grief of plague years, the soft resignation of harvests failed, the consolations found in community when nothing else could be preserved. In his rising, the sea learned the weight of endings that are also beginnings, rot that feeds soil, winter that promises spring, and the hard lesson that clinging may hurt more than letting go. These three were not yet as mortals would know them in later ages, clothed in symbols and attended by courts. They were continental shelves lifting from a world ocean, shaping tides merely by existing. Around them, lesser formations gathered like islands, nascent demons, warp entities that wear emotion as flesh, each a narrow theme made sharp. A warband's oath might echo as a horned shade. A city's plague prayer might settle into a kindly, rotting saint. A coven's secret could learn to walk as a whisper with feet. The Immaterium was acquiring ecology. The elder civilizations felt this change in their bones. The old ones, ancient progenitors and master psychers, withdrew deeper into their guarded paths. Their webways, hidden corridors shielded from raw warp, hummed with renewed wards. The Aeldari precursors, forerunners of the later Eldar Empire, shaken by storm seasons, refined craft and right to balance on the sea's knife edge. Others chose iron over insight, trusting hull and engine more than chant and rune. Yet even those who turned away could not wholly escape, for every fear they carried into the dark fed the waters behind them. It was in this era that the word temptation, the Immaterium's promise voiced to mortal want, took shape as an ambient pressure. Not command, not compulsion, just the quiet alignment of circumstance with desire. A merchant captain dared one more jump to meet a deadline and found the current miraculously swift. A scout on a starving moon discovered a spring after whispering thanks to no god in particular. A general, bone-weary, dreamed of a decisive victory and woke to a plan already formed. Gifts offered lightly, and the giver, only the sea, only what the traveler already wished. Thus is allegiance made softly, a nod, a habit, a creed. The scholars who tried to name the change disagreed. Some called it maturation of the warp, a child grown articulate. Others named it infection, mortal passion becoming parasite. A rarer few suggested reciprocity, that as minds shape the sea, in turn, tutors minds, pruning unprofitable paths and fertilizing others. Perhaps all three were true. Meanwhile, the storms took on signatures. Where Khorne's gravity pressed, translations bucked like beasts, the currents pounding in rhythmic surges. Navigators, Mutant pilots able to see warp flow spoke of red thunder with no light. In Tzeentch-haunted lanes, routes multiplied into labyrinths, every turn promising a speedier arrival, every shortcut bending back upon itself with tabled bargains. In regions hospitable to Nurgle, time stretched. Ships emerged late but intact, bearing mossed prayers and the odd comfort that the worst was somehow already endured. The Eldari precursors staged great rites to quiet these waters. Choirs of psychers, minds trained to touch the Immaterium, sang harmonics tuned to counter-specific surges. For a while, the nets held, drawing turbulence away from vital lanes. But patterns learn. Khorne's tides punched on odd beats to break the rhythm. Tzeentch altered phase with each repetition, turning countersong to chorus. Nurgle simply endured until voices failed. The sea, now with teachers of its own, showed it could be the better student. A few among the elder races attempted parley. They sought not worship but treaty, a binding exchange between realm and realm. The accounts that survive are fragmented, yet each tells the same contour. The offering began as principle, ended as petition, and the petition slowly changed its speaker. One came hoping to limit war's reach by honoring the brave dead. He returned with a spear that demanded new names to carve. Another sought wisdom from change. She returned with a script that rewrote any truth that read itself aloud. A third asked for resilience. He came back smiling through tears, unable to release the gifts clinging to him like ivy. And still the nursery of a fourth god deepened, quiet as silt. No throne rose there yet, only a pressure of absence, a hush in the sea where boundaries thinned around pleasure, pain, art, and want. The Eldari precursors' later age would pour there like a river in flood. For now, it was only foreshadow, a sweetness on the current, a chord unresolved. Those who drifted near left with dreams that were too vivid, and a hunger that ordinary life could not satisfy for long. A name would come later. Slaanesh, the warp's embodiment of excess and sensation. But the cradle was already rocking. Real space felt these births not merely as navigational hazard but as culture-bending gravity. On frontier worlds, brawling became right. On capital worlds, policy ossified or mutated overnight. On plague-haunted moons, hospice wisdom outlived the doctors who spoke it. Armies discovered that fury coordinated better than fear. Courts realized that promises, once easy currency, now bred branching debts. Villages learned that kindness endured, yet also that refusal to change could be a subtler rot. The warp had not imposed values. It had amplified extant ones until their echoes became architecture. Demonic manifestations, warp-born intrusions wearing form, grew less rare. They still came mostly as weather. A laugh in a corridor, a shadow that resisted light, a second heartbeat nowhere in the body. But sometimes they clothed themselves in myths already waiting for them. In war zones, horned silhouettes drew near fires and were called by old words. In libraries, pale motes gathered around untidy desks where problems knit themselves into answers. In plague sheds, kindly visitors stroked brows and promised that the fever would break. And often, for a time, it did. Gifts again, and the lesson repeated. The sea rewards what the shore already does. Those who mapped history saw a hinge. Before this age, the Immaterium had been a difficult road that clever peoples could pave. After it, the road had opinions about who walked it and why. Logistics became strategy, strategy became doctrine, doctrine became faith. In that layering, the galaxy leaned toward an era later called Old Night, a long age of isolation and warp storm, toward scattered lights and hard local truths. The gods' first dominions were not palaces but patterns, not empires, but habits taught to a million worlds by slow tide. Among the Aeldari precursors, a countercurrent survived: restraint as art. They codified paths of discipline, strict lodges of thought, cloisters of carefully modulated sensation, crafts that bent desire into loomwork rather than letting it spill. These traditions would seed later salvations: craft world ways, vast starborn sanctuaries, paths, runes. Even so, the balance was fragile. It is hard to preach moderation to a people who can taste stars. Harder still when the sea itself sings in the key of more. The old ones, dwindling, set final wardings and withdrew into veiled geometries. Some claim they attempted a last great gambit, knitting refuge labyrinths so elaborately shielded that even divine tides might pass them by. Perhaps a few held, most did not. Even stone dissolves under a patient ocean. So the Immaterium acquired its 4-beat: strike, scheme, endure, and yearn. 3 thrones stood in shadow, 1 cradle weighted in silk. Demons learned the art of masks. Mortals learned the cost of listening to their own reflections when the mirror had learned to speak. The calm of the timeless age lay far behind, visible only in stories told to children who had never known a windless night. And still the births were not endings but openings. A god is not a statue set upon a dais. A god in the warp is a verb that refuses to stop conjugating. With every campaign, Korn redrafted the grammar of victory. With every plot, Tzeentch edited causality sentences. With every illness born and survived, Nurgle annotated the margins of mortality with notes in green ink. And the unwritten book, bound in velvet and breath, waited on an altar that had not yet been built. The sea had found its voices. Soon the galaxy would mistake those voices for its own. Chapter 5: Heirs of the Shifting Sea. When the first great shapes rose in the Immaterium, the psychic ocean that mirrors mortal thought, the galaxy did not fall silent. It learned to listen. Empires that had once crossed calm waters now adapted to swells and undertows, and new traditions formed like reefs around which the currents broke. This was the age of inheritors, peoples and creeds that did not create the warp as it had become, yet learned to live beside its breathing. Foremost among these were the refined Aeldari, the later Eldar, an ancient psychic species, who gathered the remnants of their precursor cultures and wove them into splendor. Their webway, a shielded labyrinth of extra-dimensional tunnels, spared them the wildest seas, and their artistry turned star kingdoms into gardens. But it also taught a lesson the warp never forgets. Beauty is fuel as surely as rage. Every triumph, every ecstasy, every grief sent colored tides rolling into the Empyrean, and the sea remembered those hues. The craft world seers, Aeldari farvoyants trained to navigate fate, learned to sing quietly, to breathe in measured cadence, to carry discipline like a lantern through fog. Others, later called Drukhari, the Aeldari who rejected restraint, learned to hide in caverns of pain, drawing sustenance from torment as a smuggler draws breath in a flooded mine. On exile worlds, the Exodites, Aeldari settlers on maiden worlds, yoked passion to ritual, planting memory stones that hummed with contained feeling, like breakwaters against a hungry tide. From an older war emerged another inheritor, the Orc, echo of the Old One's Krork, a warrior species engineered as living weapons. Their gestalt field, a collective psychic pressure born of shared belief, pressed like weather upon the warp, crude yet effective. A mob's certainty could smooth a passage where charts failed, not by calculation, but by insistence. A storm bullied into fair sky through volume alone. The sea called this lesson mass, and it tucked the knowledge away, that faith, even unlettered, carries weight. Humanity woke to its inheritance last. Slowly at first, like a city feeling the tremor of far-off thunder, and then all at once, as if the horizon had tipped and poured storm over every shore. Mutations of mind appeared, psychers, humans born sensitive to the warp, and with them whispers of navigation. The navis nobilitae, navigator houses bred to see warp currents, arose hand in hand with ancient warp drives, pre-imperial translation engines, and starfall routes grew bold. Merchant princes wrote ledgers in tides and prophets in wind roses. Explorers set beacons where the sea ran quiet. Colonies lit their first lighthouses with hope. In those bright years, human voices added new registers to the Immaterium's choir. Ambition's brass, curiosity's reed, compassion's low drum. But successors do more than prosper. They preserve. Orders and covenants multiplied across a species, each a way of carrying flame through rain. Among the Eldari, spirit seers, psyker priests who tend soul stones, refined rites of memory, anchoring the departed in wraithbone, psychically responsive material, so that she who thirsts, Slanesh, the chaos power of excess, could not drink them dry. Among scattered human polities, proto-telepathic choirs, early astropathic circles, discovered how shared pain could become message, a candle guttering its light across impossible distance. On backward worlds trampled by war, shamans, pre-imperial mystics, learned to speak softly to the sea, asking for passage with humility rather than demand. Each practice was a promise kept against forgetting, that one may walk the shore without drowning. Not all inheritances were gentle. The enslavers, also called sirens, predatory warp entities, learned to hook minds through fear and draw whole populations down like nets heavy with catch, a harvest begun in elder ages and remembered too well. Spawn storms crawled through sectors like seasonal blights, and the lesson they taught was restraint poorly kept, that doors opened by hunger do not close at the eater's will. In response, enclaves of wary scholars revived Old One fragments, cribbed webway recipes from broken runes, and constructed poor but sturdy porches against the rain, hidden bastions, slow academies, star monasteries where maps were redrawn in the shadow of loss. The Necrons, ancient soulless dynasts, once Necrontyr, watched from cold sepulchres. To them, the warp was not a sea, but a disease of light, and their dynastic sciences, born of star gods long unmade, raised breakwaters of pure negation. Blackstone, psychically inert meteoritic substance, drank the tide where it touched, and in those lee shadows reality felt heavy and honest again. Their hatred taught the Immaterium another word it would not forget: silence. Even gods learn caution where an old knife waits beneath the table. Civilizations rose in patterns that mirrored their chosen answer to the sea. Some built ships like cloisters, wrapped in litany and iron, teaching crew to breathe as one so the tide would spare them. Others trained duelists of will, navigators whose third eyes charted pressure like cartographers of wind. A few, daring or desperate, learned to ride the storm's back, turning lightning to oar strokes, gambling that velocity outran appetite. Across them all, a culture of small wisdoms settled like dew. The port rituals of striking bells before translation, the quiet practice of sealing a name in wax so it could not echo, the superstition of feeding a thin line of milk to the floor, so any guest, seen or unseen, would leave gentle. These were not proofs, but courtesies to a host whose rules are older than law. In the long span men later called the Age of Strife, Old Night, an era of warp storm and isolation, those courtesies became lifelines. The Empyrean's weather turned fierce and constant, whole regions locked behind thunderheads of war-born emotion. Worlds forgot the faces of their neighbors. Languages split like shaken glass. Maps became prayer more than reference. Yet inheritance held. A craft world, vast Eldari world ship, might cross a gale by memory alone. A navigator line, thinned to 3 scribes and a cradle, might still find a filament of safe water and thread a convoy through. On dead calm nights between tempests, a frontier chapel might light lamps for passing souls, and in the morning find the lamps burnt low and the door left neatly shut. The sea had become wild, but the shore had learned patience. There were new compacts. Among humans, the forerunners of the Astra Telepathica, the later Imperial Psyker Corps, gathered the mad and the gifted alike, fashioning discipline from ruin. Black ship antecedents, proto-fleets that ferried psychers, began their grim pilgrimages, exchanging safety for service, stabilizing a handful of roots enough that message and mercy could still move. Among the Eldari, path doctrines, austere disciplines that constrain impulse, hardened into way of life. Narrow bridges laid across chasms of desire. Orc empires waxed and waned with the volume of their laughter, bellowing fair winds into being by the simple conviction that they would arrive. Even the Necrons reached clawed hands into storm to snatch relics from the swirl, choosing which memories reality was allowed to keep. The Immaterium, for its part, continued its education. It learned that quiet communities feed calmer currents than empires aflame, that a vow kept for 1,000 years rings louder than any shout, that grief sung in harmony hurts the sea less than grief screamed alone. And so, in pockets and patches, fair weather returned, not the glassy peace of the first ages, but breaks in the canopy, moon ovals of gentle water, where a captain could unbind his shoulders and a seer could set down her cup. This was the mercy of successors, not to undo the storm, but to shape a coast that people could live upon. In time, a figure would step from Terra's dust, Terra, cradle of humanity, to bind many of these threads into a banner, to raise lighthouses bright enough that even gods took notice. That is, for another night. For now, the tale rests with those who kept the lamps through long weather, the shipwrights and singers, the navigators and knot-tears, the clans who learned to pass down a right way to speak to a dangerous sea. In their small, stubborn wisdoms, the warp found neighbors rather than prey, and the galaxy learned the oldest rule of any shoreline, that endurance is a kind of art. Chapter 6. The Shattered Veil. The galaxy of the present age lives in the shadow of a wound. It is a wound that spans light years, a rent in reality itself, where the thin skin between real space and the Immaterium has been torn wide. The ancients once whispered that the warp's storms came and went like seasons. Now there is no such comfort. This is the time of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, and the seas between stars are more perilous than at any point since the first ages of storm. The rift opened in the wake of the 13th Black Crusade, when the War Master of Chaos, Abaddon the Despoiler, struck with such precision and fury that the fortress world of Cadia fell. Cadia, whose pylons of blackstone had stood for 10 millennia, anchoring a region of rare stability, was not merely a bastion of war. It was a keystone holding back the sea. When the pylons shattered, the tides they had restrained surged free. From the wound spilled storms so vast they blotted constellations from the sight of navigators. The rift cleaved the galaxy in two. On one side lay the Imperium Sanctus, the half of the Emperor's realm still tenuously bound to Terra and its Astronomican beacon. On the other side lay the Imperium Nihilus, the night without light, cut off from the guiding signal, stranded in an endless swell where even the most gifted navigators saw only churning black. The warp had always been treacherous. But now it had moods that were more than weather. In some regions, time fractured, a voyage of hours stretching into centuries. In others, thought itself bled into the sea, so that ships emerged with crews who remembered lives they had never lived. The demonic powers whose thrones had been carved in earlier ages strode more openly across the currents. In the Nihilus, whole sectors became hunting grounds, where the line between real space and Immaterium dissolved into dream and nightmare. For humanity, the rift was disaster. Worlds that had known the touch of the Imperium's rule for 10,000 years vanished overnight from all contact. Star systems starved without the steady flow of void-born trade. Frontier colonies found themselves beset by things they could not name, whose claws could reach from the void into the very hearts of their dreams. And yet, not all who dwelt in the galaxy saw only ruin. The Aeldari, whose Farseers had charted the warp's tempests for millennia, read the rift as both doom and opportunity. Through its storm, they glimpsed pathways into long-hidden regions of the Empyrean, corridors that might lead to artifacts lost since before the fall. To them, the rift was a storm large enough to conceal their own movements from the eyes of their greatest enemies, and from the gaze of she who thirsts. The servants of the Chaos Gods welcomed it more openly still. To the legions of the traitor Astartes, it was a highway of war. Armies could spill from the sea into real space without the warning that once came from the flare of translation drives. To demonic hosts, it was a breach so wide they could stride through without the old bindings of summoning or sacrifice. Whole demon worlds within the Eye of Terror stretched their tendrils into the rift, testing how far they could reach into the waking galaxy before the fabric of reality pulled them back. In the Imperium's heartlands, the Astronomican's light still shone, though even there it flickered. Some navigators whispered that the beacon's song had changed, a subtle shift in pitch, as if the Emperor's will itself strained under the weight of the breach. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica trained their astropaths harder than ever, for the sea's interference garbled their soul voices into riddles. Many messages now arrived with weeks, months, or decades delay, or never at all. There were stranger consequences still. Across the rift's breadth, the barrier between thought and substance grew thin. Ghosts of cities appeared in orbit, fading in the dawn. Shapes of colossal size, perhaps the shadows of warp-born titans, passed slowly over the surfaces of inhabited worlds, leaving no mark but the quieting of every voice until they had gone. The adepts of Mars whispered of machine spirits that woke unbidden and spoke in languages dead for 10,000 years. On feral planets, tribes claimed to see omens in the stars, constellations shifting nightly, as if the heavens themselves were trying to tell their own story. The rift is no single storm. It is a chain of tempests, some vast enough to swallow sectors whole, others narrow as a canyon, funneling travelers through at deadly speed. Charting these is the work of every astrogator, rogue trader, and warlord who dares the currents. Some are said to lead to sanctuaries untouched by the demonic tide. Others are whispered to be traps, mazes woven by the changer of ways to keep prey turning in endless circles. And yet, as in every age since the first stirring of the warp, life persists. Fleets learn to sail the edge of the storms, using their fury to hide from pursuers. Whole communities adapt to the shadow, becoming invisible even to demons by surrendering all thought of violence or desire during the tide's passing. Among the Imperium's crusades, heroes rise to bridge the darkness, carrying light into Nihilus in the form of relief, defense, or vengeance. The rift is not the end of the warp's story. It is only the current chapter, the latest shape the sea has chosen to wear, and as it has always done, the sea will remember the voices that speak into it now. It will carry those voices forward, magnifying them, blending them, until the next age of change comes upon the galaxy. For the warp does not rest, it waits, it learns, and every storm is a prelude to the next. Chapter 7. Artifacts and Entities of the Deep. The warp is a sea of memory, but not all memories fade. Some condense, harden, and persist, relics adrift upon the tides, carrying with them the weight of the ages. These are not always objects in the material sense. In the Immaterium, a thing may be a shape of thought, a melody no mind can forget, or a fragment of a god's attention that has learned to hold itself together. Yet for those who sail its depths, these artifacts are as real as any stone blade or iron helm. The most infamous of these relics are those that have crossed the veil into real space. The black stone fortresses, titanic constructs of impossible geometry, drift like islands upon the currents. To the Imperium, they are weapons, for each one contains the power to drink the warp's energy until a region of space lies in unnatural stillness. To the servants of chaos, they are obstacles to be broken or claimed, for nothing threatens a demonic host like the silencing of the sea. Though their origin lies with the ancient Necrontyr and the Old Ones, their presence in the current age is a reminder that not all artifacts are born of the warp itself. Some are its hunters, others are more subtle. The choir crystals of Lix once formed the heart of a pre-imperial civilization that sang its messages across the void. Each crystal retains an echo of the last song it carried, and when brought into the warp, these harmonies calm a storm for as long as the note endures. Yet they are finite. Once the final tone fades, the crystal dissolves into glittering mist. Rogue traders speak of fortunes made and lost in the hunt for the last few unspent shards. Among the Eldari, the most precious are the soul stones, psychic gems that capture the essence of the dead, shielding them from the predation of she who thirsts. In the warp, these stones burn like stars, each a fixed point of selfhood amid shifting currents. Craftworld voyagers sometimes scatter false stones, each carrying a shard of carefully woven memory, to distract or confuse demons hunting their path. Not all relics are welcome. Some are traps, born of the warp's own will or crafted by its lords. The Book of Magnus, said to be written in a tongue that reshapes itself to fit the reader's knowledge, is one such snare. In truth, there are many books of Magnus, each a shard of the Thousand Suns Primarch's vast intellect, cast adrift as bait. To read even a single line is to invite the sea's whisper into the mind, a whisper that promises truth if only one will listen longer. Entities, too, wander the deep like living relics. Some are the demons of the great powers, their forms and names etched into the nightmares of whole species. Others are stranger still, independents, if such a word can be applied to beings of pure thought. The glass pilgrim is one, a translucent figure that walks the currents carrying an unlit lantern. Those who follow it are said to reach their destination unharmed, though they will never be able to recall the journey. Whether it is a spirit of mercy or a trap that feeds on memory is a question none have answered twice. There are the warp whales, vast and slow, whose bodies are constellations of light swimming through the deep. Their passing is a rare blessing, for the storms quiet in their wake. Some scholars believe they are the dreams of long-dead star gods, given form by the Immaterium's currents. Others suggest they are older still, as old as the warp itself, feeding on the harmonies between thought and matter. More feared are the predators of the maw, immense, formless hungers that lurk in the lee of storms. They do not wear the faces of demons, nor do they parley. They are the purest expression of the warp's appetite, striking with a suddenness that leaves even battle-hardened navigators unable to speak of what they saw. Some claim they are the discarded thoughts of the dark gods, given independence and set loose. Others say They are what the gods will become if the galaxy ever falls silent. Artifacts and entities are bound by a common truth. The warp remembers them because they make it remember. A relic becomes a landmark. A creature becomes a constellation. For those who sail the sea, these are as vital to navigation as charts and compasses. A navigator may mark a course by the flicker of the lanternless isle. A rogue trader may measure risk by the presence or absence of the dreamer's current. Even the fleets of chaos watch for these signs, for though they serve the gods, the sea is older than any throne upon it. The Imperium keeps its own catalog, the Index Obscurus, maintained in the sealed vaults of Terra. Few are allowed to consult it, and fewer still are permitted to act upon its contents. For each artifact that might save a world, there is another that could damn a sector, and the line between them is as thin as a ripple on still water. To know of these relics is to be tempted. A captain whose fuel runs low may risk a path to acquire crystal. A warlord may seek a blackstone fragment to turn the tide of a siege. An inquisitor may follow the glass pilgrim into a storm, seeking truths no mortal should hold. And in each case, the warp watches, for the act of seeking shapes the sea as much as the finding. The deep does not hoard without reason. Every relic taken leaves a space behind, and that space does not stay empty. Sometimes it fills with calm, and sometimes with something that was waiting, patient as the tide. And so the galaxy sails on, mapping the impossible, chasing the fleeting, trading in treasures that are as much dream as matter. The sea carries these relics forward, scattering them across ages and sectors, weaving them into the stories of countless voyages. Each is a reminder that the warp is not just storm and shadow, but memory, and memory, once made, is never truly gone. Chapter 8. Approaching the end of the cycle. The warp does not end. It changes, swells, and falls away, yet always returns in another shape. Across the long memory of the galaxy, each calm has been followed by a storm. Each storm by a new equilibrium, and each equilibrium by the slow gathering of another tide. Those who study the Immaterium in this age whisper that the pattern is turning again. The great rift has not closed. Its storms have not lessened, and in many regions they have only deepened. Where once the cicatrix maledictum was a wound between two halves of the galaxy, it is now a living frontier. Empires, both mortal and demonic, have learned to live along its edges, to send fleets into its heart. They have begun to map its tempests, to claim its passageways, and in doing so, they have fed it. Every act within the warp leaves a mark. The wars waged across its surface during this current age are unlike those of the past, greater in scale, more deliberate in their shaping of the sea. In the ancient times, storms were accidents of emotion, spun by the passions of countless worlds. Now, storms are born with purpose. Rituals on demon worlds send waves across sectors. Imperial crusades drive their fleets through the rift in tides of faith and fury that leave wakes behind them. The warp has always learned from what it is given, and now it is being taught that it can be shaped like a weapon. This is the quiet fear of those who watch most closely, that the sea will remember this lesson, and that it will apply it for itself. If storms can be made to serve strategy, they can also be made to rule it. A current turned by a human fleet may one day turn of its own will, bending wars to its choosing. In such a future, mortals may no longer be the authors of their own histories, merely actors upon a stage set by the tides. Signs gather. Navigators report regions where the warp feels expectant, as though the currents are waiting for some unseen signal. Artifacts lost for centuries have begun to reappear in patterns, each arrival echoing another in some distant sector. Demonic incursions follow sequences too precise to be coincidence, their timing echoing events half a galaxy away. To the untrained eye, these are isolated phenomena. To those who listen, they are footsteps in the deep. Among the Eldari Farseers, prophecies speak of the sea learning to dream in cycles, a tide that will rise not because of any single war or god's hunger, but because the sea itself desires it. Some believe this will be the birth of a new great power, a fifth presence to stand alongside the thrones of Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. Others think it will be the sea's turning away from all thrones, claiming dominion for itself. In the Imperium, such theories are heresy. Yet even the Adeptus Astra Telepathica cannot deny the increase in psychic phenomena that feel less like the influence of a god and more like the pressure of the sea as a whole. Messages arrive not garbled, but too clear, carrying knowledge the sender did not have. Dreams shared between entire ship crews carry warnings that prove true weeks later. The distinction between guidance and manipulation has never been thinner. The sea's memory is long. It remembers the stillness before time, the first ripples of thought, the shaping of gods, the opening of the great rift. It remembers every war waged upon its surface, every plea made to its depths, and if the cycle is truly turning, it will remember what comes next as well, whether that is the rise of new guardians, the fall of old empires, or the reshaping of the galaxy in ways that no chart can hold. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the warp does not move in haste. To mortals, the rift's opening may seem like a sudden wound, but to the sea, it is simply the latest note in a song it has been humming for millions of years. The tides may take another millennium to reach their peak, or they may rise tomorrow without warning, swallowing light and shadow alike. And yet, life continues. Fleets still sail, guided by stars that remain, for now, in their familiar places. Worlds still trade, still dream, still pray. Even those who suspect that the end of the current cycle is near know that endings in the warp are only another beginning. When the tides shift, they do not erase the shore, they redraw it. In the calm between storms, there is always the illusion that the worst has passed. But those who have sailed the warp for long enough know that calm is simply the time in which the next tide is gathering its strength. And in this age, the calm is thin, stretched over currents that hum like bowstrings. The galaxy stands on the edge of a change it cannot yet see, but whose presence it can feel in the bones. The next shape of the sea is coming. It may rise as a wave, it may descend as a shadow, it may open as a door. Whatever form it takes, it will not be the first, and it will not be the last. For the warp, like the galaxy it mirrors, moves in endless circles. And the end of the cycle is only the beginning of another. The warp has been many things: mirror, storm, and endless tide. It has carried the dreams of the first minds, worn the faces of gods, and reshaped the fate of countless worlds. From stillness to tempest, from the first ripple to the great rift, it has moved in unbroken cycles. Now the galaxy drifts in another turning. The tides are high, the currents strange, and no one can say what shore they will find next. Yet through every age, life has learned to endure. Ships still sail, worlds still dream. Even in the darkest storms, there are always those who find a path home. The warp will go on, as it always has, changing, remembering, and waiting for the next voice to enter its depths. For those who walk its shores, the journey is never truly over. It only leads to another horizon. And now, as our telling ends, let the noise of the day fade away. Picture the calm between storms, the hush of an ocean that sleeps beneath the stars. Rest in that stillness. The sea will keep its watch until morning. Sleep well.